May 4th, 1967. Firebase Delta, Quang Tri Province. The monsoon rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof like distant machine gun fire, each drop a percussion note in the symphony of Vietnam's Central Highlands. Staff Sergeant Michael Thornton crouched in the dim light of the armory tent, his hands moving with practiced precision over the disassembled M16 rifle spread across the worn wooden table. Around him, 7 other men worked in focused silence, their fingers blackened with gun oil and carbon fouling, their faces etched with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from watching men die, because their weapons failed them. In Thornton's calloused hands was an enemy AK-47 magazine, Chinese Type 56, flat-backed, its steel surface scarred and dented from months of jungle combat. Next to it lay a standard 20-round M16 magazine, aluminum, lightweight, insufficient. The mathematics were brutal and simple. 20 rounds against an enemy that carried 30. 3 seconds of automatic fire against 4.5. In the dense triple canopy jungle where visibility rarely exceeded 20 meters, and firefights erupted with the sudden violence of thunderstorms, those extra 10 rounds represented the difference between survival and a body bag on a Chinook heading to Tan Son Nut. "You really think this'll work, Sarge?" Private First Class. Danny Martinez watched from across the tent, his voice barely audible over the rain. He was 19 years old, from El Paso, in country for 6 weeks, still young enough to believe in official solutions to unofficial problems. Thornton didn't look up. His hands continued their work, a hand file rasping against the magazine catch of the AK magazine, metal shavings falling like snow onto the dirt floor. It worked for the ARVN guys down at Duke Co. It'll work for us. What Martinez couldn't understand yet, what none of the new replacements could grasp until they'd lived through their first sustained firefight, was that the M16 rifle sitting in pieces on that table represented one of the great betrayals of the Vietnam War. A weapon that had been promised as revolutionary, as maintenance-free, as the answer to the AK-47's jungle dominance, had instead become a lottery ticket. Pull the trigger and pray. Would it fire? Would it jam? Would the spent cartridge extract? Or would you be left frantically trying to clear a malfunction while enemy rounds tore through the bamboo around you? The story of how American soldiers came to modify their weapons in the jungles of Vietnam is not merely a tale of mechanical ingenuity. It is a chronicle of institutional failure, of bureaucratic decisions made in air-conditioned Pentagon offices that sentenced men to die in rice paddies and triple canopy jungle. It is the story of how the most technologically advanced military in human history issued its frontline troops a rifle that failed at rates approaching 30% in some units, and how those troops, abandoned by the system that sent them to war, took matters into their own hands. The weapon that would become the M16 began its life in 1956 in the offices of Armalite, a small California firearms company in Hollywood. Eugene Stoner, a former Marine and self-taught weapons designer, had created something genuinely revolutionary. The AR-15, as it was initially designated, represented a radical departure from traditional military rifle design, where the M14 battle rifle that preceded it weighed nearly 11 pounds loaded and fired a heavy 7.62 millimeter NATO cartridge. Stoner's creation weighed just 6.5 pounds and fired a small, high-velocity 5.56 millimeter round. The genius of Stoner's design lay in its operating system. Unlike conventional rifles that used a piston to cycle the action, the AR-15 employed direct gas impingement. Hot gases from fired cartridges were diverted through a tube back into the rifle's receiver, where they drove the bolt carrier group backward, ejecting the spent case and loading a fresh round. The system was elegant, simple, and when properly maintained with the correct ammunition, remarkably reliable. In July 1960, Air Force General Curtis LeMay witnessed a demonstration of the AR-15 at a shooting range. What he saw impressed him deeply. The rifle's lightweight, low recoil, and devastating terminal ballistics made it ideal for base security forces. LeMay ordered 8,500 rifles for the Air Force. It was the beginning of a journey that would lead to over 8 million M16 rifles being produced, but it was also the beginning of a series of modifications and cost-cutting decisions that would have lethal consequences. The early deployment of the AR-15 to Vietnam in 1962 and 1963 was limited to Special Forces units and their South Vietnamese counterparts. These initial users loved the weapon. In the hands of small-statured Vietnamese troops, the lightweight rifle was a revelation. Special Forces advisors reported phenomenal success. The rifle worked flawlessly, required minimal maintenance, and delivered devastating firepower. These early AR-15s were built to Eugene Stoner's original specifications, using IMR 4475 stick powder in their ammunition, and featured chambers and barrels manufactured to precise tolerances. Then came the Battle of Ia Drang Valley in November 1965, the first major engagement between regular U.S. Army forces and the North Vietnamese Army. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, equipped with the newly designated XM16E1 rifles, fought a desperate 3-day battle against overwhelming numbers. In his after-action report, Moore credited the new rifle with saving his battalion. "Without the M16," he wrote, "we might not have survived." But even as Moore praised the weapon, dark clouds were gathering. In 1963, 2 years before Ia Drang, the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps had made a fateful decision that would echo through every firefight of the coming war. They changed the gunpowder used in M16 ammunition from IMR 4475 stick powder to WD-846 ball powder. The rationale was logical on paper. Ball powder produced higher muzzle velocity and was cheaper to manufacture. What the Army failed to account for was that ball powder burned significantly dirtier than stick powder, leaving far more carbon residue in the rifle's gas system and chamber. The increased rate of fire caused by the different powder also stressed components in ways they weren't designed to handle. At the same time, the Army, seeking to reduce costs, made several other modifications to Stoner's original design. They declined to chrome plate the chamber and bore, a process that prevented corrosion in humid tropical environments. They switched to softer brass for ammunition cases, which were more prone to tearing during extraction. They failed to issue cleaning kits with the rifles and instructed troops that the weapon was self-cleaning and required minimal maintenance. The combination of these decisions created a perfect storm of failure. By the summer of 1966, as more and more infantry units rotated into Vietnam, equipped with M16s, reports began filtering back of catastrophic reliability problems. Rifles were jamming at rates that beggared belief. In some units, 30% of weapons failed during firefights. Men were dying not from enemy action, but from mechanical failure. Private First Class Michael Andrew Jones wrote home to his mother in September 1966. The letter, later entered into congressional records, painted a stark picture. "Out of 40 rounds I've fired, my rifle jammed about 10 times. I pack as many grenades as I can, plus bayonet and K-bar, so I'll have something to fight with. If you can, please send me a bore rod and a 1 1/4 inch paintbrush. I need it for my rifle. Guys are getting killed because their rifles jam. Private Jones was killed in action 3 weeks later during a firefight near Chu Lai. According to his squad members, he died trying to clear a jammed M16. The failure mechanism was grimly consistent. During firing, a spent cartridge case would become stuck in the chamber, unable to be extracted by the bolt carrier group. The carbon buildup from the ball powder, combined with the humid environment and lack of chrome plating, created a surface that gripped the soft brass cases like a vice. Soldiers found themselves in the middle of firefights, frantically trying to force cleaning rods down their barrels to punch out stuck cases, turning their automatic rifles into single-shot weapons that took 30 seconds to reload. The psychological impact was devastating. Combat effectiveness is built on trust. Trust in your weapon, trust in your squad, trust in the institution that sent you to war. When that trust erodes, when you pull the trigger and nothing happens, when your buddy dies because his rifle jammed, it creates a corrosive doubt that spreads through a unit like a plague. Soldiers began requesting M14 rifles, the weapon the M16 was supposed to replace. Some units, particularly Marine Corps units in I Corps, began actively seeking captured AK-47s. The Soviet-designed rifle was heavier, fired a larger round, and had more recoil, but it had one quality that trumped all others in the jungle. It worked. Always. You could bury an AK in a rice paddy, dig it up 3 months later, and it would fire. The loose tolerances that made it less accurate at long range gave it a reliability in adverse conditions that no Western rifle could match. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, known as MACV-SOG, epitomized the American response to the M16's failures. SOG was the most classified unit in Vietnam, conducting clandestine operations into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. These were small teams, typically 8 to 12 men, operating hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, with no hope of reinforcement if things went wrong. For SOG, weapon reliability wasn't a preference, it was a survival requirement. SOG teams received priority access to the best equipment available. They were issued the XM1772, also known as the CAR-15 or Colt Commando, a compact carbine version of the M16. With its 11.5-inch barrel and collapsible stock, the XM1772 was dramatically shorter than the standard M16, measuring just 28 inches with the stock collapsed compared to the M16's 39 inches. In the dense jungle where SOG operated, this compactness was invaluable. But even the CAR-15 suffered from the same fundamental problems as its larger cousin. The short barrel actually exacerbated some issues, increasing the rate of fire and carbon buildup. SOG recon men, however, had access to something regular infantry units didn't: time to modify their weapons and the implicit permission to do whatever was necessary to survive. Sergeant Major Billy Wall, a SOI legend who would later serve in Delta Force, described the modifications his team made to their CAR-15s. "We'd take a standard Colt pistol grip and mount it backwards under the handguard as a forward grip. Gave you much better control on full auto. We'd swap out the standard moderator for a birdcage flash suppressor. Yeah, it was louder, but the original suppressor would glow cherry red after sustained fire and give away your position anyway. Some guys even mounted XM148 grenade launchers under their CAR-15s, though I thought that threw off the balance." The forward grip modification became ubiquitous among Special Operations Forces. The CAR-15's short barrel and high rate of fire made it difficult to control during automatic fire. By adding a vertical foregrip, usually a spare M16 pistol grip mounted upside down and backwards, operators could maintain better control and accuracy during close-quarters firefights. This modification would later influence the official adoption of vertical foregrips on military rifles, but in 1967 it was pure field expedient engineering. Another critical modification addressed the magazine issue. The M16 was originally issued with 20-round aluminum magazines. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong carried AK-47s with 30-round steel magazines. In a close-range firefight, this 10-round deficit could be fatal. 30-round M16 magazines didn't become widely available until 1970, and even then, there were never enough to displace the 20-round magazines completely. Someone in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese military, discovered something remarkable. A Chinese Type 56 AK magazine with modification could be made to function in an M16 rifle. The process required skill, patience, and a willingness to void every warranty and regulation in the book, but it worked. The modification began with finding the right magazine. Chinese Type 56 magazines had a critical feature that Soviet or Eastern European AK magazines lacked. They were flat-backed, without the reinforcing spine that characterized other AK magazines. This flat back allowed the magazine to physically fit into the M16's magazine well. The Chinese follower was also narrower, which helped when feeding the much smaller 5.56 mm cartridge. The process of conversion was methodical. First, using a hand file or bench grinder, the AK magazine catch had to be completely removed. The protrusion on the front of the magazine that locked into the AK's magazine latch had no function in an M16 and would prevent the magazine from seating. Once removed, additional filing smoothed the surface until the magazine would slide cleanly into the M16's magazine well. Next came the most critical modification, adjusting the feed lips. The AK magazine's feed lips were designed for the much larger 7.62 mm cartridge. To reliably feed 5.56 mm ammunition, the feed lips had to be carefully filed to raise the cartridges higher in the magazine, ensuring they would be stripped properly into the chamber. This required precision. File too much, and the magazine wouldn't retain cartridges. File too little, and the rounds wouldn't feed. It was a Goldilocks problem that required patience and several test-fit attempts. Finally, a hole had to be cut in the magazine body to accommodate the M16's push-button magazine release. The M16 used a push-button release on the right side of the receiver, very different from the AK's paddle-style release. A carefully positioned hole allowed the M16's release to engage the magazine body and secure it in place. The result was an M16 magazine that could hold 35 rounds of 5.56 mm ammunition, though most soldiers loaded only 30 to reduce spring tension and prevent feeding problems. It was ugly. It was completely unauthorized, and it violated every technical manual ever written. It also worked. Staff Sergeant Thornton had learned the technique from an ARVN Ranger advisor at Duke Firebase 2 months earlier. The ARVN had been modifying AK magazines for their M16s since late 1966, driven by the same desperate mathematics that now drove Thornton. Now, as rain pounded the tin roof of the armory tent, he was passing that knowledge to his squad. The key is the feed lips, Thornton explained, holding up the partially modified magazine so the gathered soldiers could see. You need to check the height after every couple of file strokes. Too high, and the rounds won't strip. Too low, and they'll jam. What if we just used AKs? Martinez asked. It was a question that hung in the air of every armory tent and firebase in Vietnam. Thornton set down the file and looked at the young private. Some guys do. SEALs use them sometimes, SOG teams, but there are problems. First, you're using enemy ammunition. That means scavenging from bodies or captured caches. You run out in the middle of a firefight, your buddies can't resupply you. Second, the sound signature is different. You fire an AK, every American in earshot thinks you're the enemy. Trigger-happy lieutenant or door gunner might light you up before they realize their mistake. Third, and this is the big one, you get captured carrying an AK, the Geneva Convention doesn't apply. You're a spy, not a soldier. They can execute you on the spot. The legal reality was stark. The laws of war required combatants to wear uniforms and carry weapons openly to receive prisoner of war status. An American soldier carrying an enemy weapon in enemy-controlled territory could be classified as a saboteur and summarily executed. It was a risk some special operations soldiers were willing to take, but it was a calculation that had to be made with open eyes. The improvised modifications extended far beyond magazines. The M14 rifle, the M16's predecessor, saw extensive field modifications despite being phased out of frontline service. Many of these M14s ended up with rear echelon units, advisors, and specialized troops who valued the weapon's power and reliability over the M16's light weight. The most common M14 modification was barrel shortening. The standard M14 had a 22-inch barrel, making it long and cumbersome in the close confines of jungle warfare. Soldiers and unit armorers began cutting down barrels to 18 or even 16 inches, dramatically reducing overall length and weight. The shortened M14 lost some velocity and accuracy at long range, but most firefights in Vietnam occurred at ranges under 100 meters, where these factors were irrelevant. Some M14s received more extensive modifications. Forward pistol grips were added for better control during automatic fire. The M14's selective fire capability was often problematic. Its powerful 7.62 millimeter cartridge made it nearly uncontrollable in full automatic mode. The forward grip helped, though it couldn't completely tame the beast. Magazine modifications for the M14 followed similar logic to the M16. Standard M14 magazines held 20 rounds. In the field, soldiers began welding two 20-round magazines together, end-to-end, creating 40-round capacity magazines. These field-expedient double magazines were heavy and awkward, but they addressed the fundamental problem of insufficient ammunition capacity during sustained firefights. The M60 machine gun, the Pig, as it was affectionately known, became a canvas for field modifications. The M60 was the squad's heavy weapon, a belt-fed machine gun firing 7.62 millimeter ammunition at rates up to 550 rounds per minute. It was also heavy, weighing 23 pounds empty, and prone to specific failure points that soldiers learned to address. The simplest M60 modification was the C-ration can fix. The M60's feed mechanism could be temperamental, especially when dirt or debris interfered with the ammunition belt feeding into the gun. Some enterprising machine gunner discovered that a C-ration can, the ubiquitous olive drab tin that contained military meals, could be taped or wired to the side of the gun's receiver. As the ammunition belt fed into the gun, it would pass through the can, which acted as a guide and kept dirt away from the feeding mechanism. It was crude but effective, and photographs from Vietnam show countless M60s with C-ration cans attached. More extensive M60 modifications included barrel shortening, particularly among Navy SEAL teams and other special operations forces operating in riverine environments. The standard M60 barrel was 22 inches long, making the weapon difficult to maneuver in tight spaces like sampans or bunkers. Cutting the barrel down to 16 or even 14 inches significantly reduced weight and length. The shorter barrel increased muzzle flash and reduced effective range, but for the close-quarters environments where SEAL teams operated, these trade-offs were acceptable. Some M60 gunners added custom forward grips, often welded or bolted to the barrel jacket, to provide better control during sustained fire. The M60's bipod was frequently removed to save weight, and improvised carrying handles were added to make it easier to bring the gun into action quickly. Perhaps the most dramatic M60 modification was seen in helicopter door gun applications. UH-1 Huey helicopters commonly mounted M60 machine guns in their doors for suppressive fire during insertion and extraction of infantry units. Some units created double-mount configurations, with two M60s mounted side by side, effectively doubling the volume of fire that could be brought to bear. These twin M60 configurations required custom mounting hardware and ammunition feed systems, all fabricated in unit machine shops or by enterprising crew chiefs using materials at hand. The M16 itself saw modifications beyond magazine conversions. Some soldiers attached telescopic sights, usually M84 scopes designed for sniper rifles, to create improvised designated marksman rifles. These scoped M16s filled a gap in the infantry squad's capabilities, providing accurate fire at ranges beyond what iron sights could achieve, but without the weight and expense of dedicated sniper rifles. Camouflage painting became standard practice, despite being technically against regulations. The M16's black plastic furniture and gray anodized aluminum receiver were distinctly non-natural colors that stood out in the jungle. Soldiers began painting their rifles in mottled patterns of green and brown, using whatever paint was available. Some used aircraft paint scavenged from Air Force bases. Others used spray paint purchased from PX stores or sent from home. The goal was to break up the rifle's outline and reduce glare from the aluminum receiver. Suppressor usage in Vietnam, while not a field modification per se, represented the military's acknowledgement of the need for specialized weapons. The heli or suppressor, a large cylindrical device that attached to the M16's barrel, reduced both sound signature and muzzle flash. Combined with subsonic ammunition, the suppressed M16 was valuable for ambush operations and sentry elimination. While most suppressors were officially issued items rather than field fabrications, soldiers often modified them with additional wrapping or heat shielding to prevent burns during extended use. The XM177 carbine, the CAR-15 that SOG loved, saw stock swaps as a common modification. The XM177's telescoping stock was revolutionary for its time, but had limitations. The aluminum stock was relatively fragile and provided limited cheek weld for accurate shooting. Some operators swapped the telescoping stock for the standard fixed stock from an M16A1, accepting the increased length in exchange for improved durability and shooting platform. The opposite modification was also common, taking an M16A1 upper receiver and mating it with an XM177 lower receiver, creating a hybrid weapon that combined the M16's longer barrel and better ballistics with the XM170's compact stock configuration. These hybrid rifles were excellent handling weapons that represented a middle ground between the full-size M16 and the stubby XM177. One of the most extensive modification programs involved captured enemy weapons, specifically the RPD light machine gun. The RPD was a Soviet-designed squad automatic weapon firing 7.62 mm by 39 mm ammunition from a 100-round drum magazine. It was lighter than the M60 and had excellent reliability, but it was a distinctive enemy weapon with all the problems that entailed. SOG teams began modifying captured RPDs into highly compact light machine guns. The The process involved cutting down the barrel to as short as 14 inches, removing the bipod, and sometimes shortening the stock. The resulting weapon was extraordinarily compact for a light machine gun, providing massive firepower in a package that could be wielded in close quarters. These cut-down RPDs became popular with SOG recon teams operating in Laos and Cambodia, where their lightweight and reliability were valued over the standardization concerns that troubled regular units. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment operating in Vietnam took weapon modification to another level with their L1A1 self-loading rifles. The L1A1 was the Australian version of the British FN-FIL, a 7.62 mm battle rifle known for its reliability and power. Australian SAS troopers began extensively modifying their L1A1s for jungle warfare, including cutting down barrels, converting the normally semi-automatic weapons to full automatic fire, adding forward pistol grips, and even fitting XM148 grenade launchers. Some Australian modifications bordered on the extreme. Photographs from the period show L1A1s with barrels cut to less than 16 inches, custom flash hiders, and forward grips fashioned from spare pistol grips, or even wood carved in the field. Some Australian troops even attached XM148 grenade launchers to their Sterling submachine guns, creating a unique combination of 9 mm automatic fire and 40 mm grenade capability. The technical challenges of these modifications were substantial. Cutting down a barrel wasn't simply a matter of sawing off the end. The barrel had to be cut squarely, and ideally the crown of the muzzle had to be properly cut and polished to maintain accuracy. Most field modifications couldn't achieve this level of precision, resulting in weapons that were less accurate than their unmodified counterparts. But in the jungle, where most engagements happened at ranges measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds, this loss of precision was acceptable. The legal and regulatory status of these modifications existed in a gray area. Technically, soldiers were not authorized to modify their issued weapons. Field manuals and regulations specified that modifications required official approval through proper channels. In practice, these regulations were widely ignored at the small unit level, particularly in combat zones where commanders focused on mission accomplishment rather than technical manual compliance. Some modifications were tacitly approved by chain of command. When a battalion commander saw his troops performing better in combat with modified weapons, he wasn't likely to order a return to factory specifications. Other modifications were performed covertly, hidden from higher authority, with soldiers and armorers collaborating to keep the modifications off official paperwork. The institutional response to the M16's reliability problems was glacially slow compared to the field modifications. By 1967, the Army and Colt began implementing official design changes. The chamber and barrel were chrome-plated to resist corrosion. A forward assist was added to allow soldiers to manually ensure the bolt was fully closed. The stock was reinforced. Cleaning kits were issued, and training on proper weapon maintenance was dramatically improved. These changes, designated the M16A1, finally delivered the reliability that had been promised from the beginning. But the improvements came too late for thousands of soldiers who had died in firefights with jammed weapons. The bitterness over the M16's early failures persisted throughout the war and beyond. Veterans of the early years never fully trusted the weapon, even after it had been fixed. By 1968 and 1969, as the improved M16A1 reached Vietnam in large numbers, the reliability problems diminished. Soldiers still performed field modifications, but now they were driven by tactical preferences rather than desperate necessity. the improvised modifications gradually shifted from survival adaptations to performance enhancements. The magazine modification using AK parts continued through the late war period, particularly among South Vietnamese forces who had developed considerable expertise in the technique. American units had better access to official 30-round M16 magazines as production increased, reducing the need for improvised solutions. But the knowledge remained, passed from veteran to replacement in armory tents and firebase bunkers, a secret handshake of soldiers who had learned not to trust official promises. The psychological impact of the modification culture ran deep. Soldiers learned that survival meant self-reliance, that official channels couldn't always be trusted, that sometimes the only person who could save your life was yourself with a file and some ingenuity. This lesson, learned in the jungles of Vietnam, would influence a generation of veterans who returned home questioning institutional authority in ways that previous generations had not. The congressional investigation into the M16's failures, sparked by letters from soldiers like Private Jones, eventually led to significant changes in weapons acquisition procedures. The ICORD Committee report, delivered in 1967, was scathing in its assessment of the Army's handling of the M16 program. The report documented how cost-cutting measures, unauthorized design changes, and inadequate testing had combined to create a weapon that failed its users. But even as Congress investigated and Colt implemented fixes, soldiers in the field continued to modify their weapons. The culture of modification had become embedded in the fabric of the war. Unit armorers, many of whom were draftees with no formal military training, became experts in improvised gunsmithing. They learned which modifications worked and which didn't. They developed informal networks, sharing information and techniques across units and even between services. The evolution of these modifications followed a pattern. A soldier or small group would experiment with a modification, often based on observation of Allied forces or captured enemy equipment. If the modification proved successful in combat, it would spread through the unit. If a soldier from that unit was transferred, or if units operated together on combined operations, the modification would spread further. Successful modifications could go from individual experimentation to battalion-wide adoption in a matter of weeks. Some modifications were preserved in photographs that made their way home in letters and eventually into historical archives. Looking at these images today, you can see the evolution of soldier-level innovation. Early war photographs show relatively stock weapons. By 1968 and 1969, almost every weapon in photographs shows some level of modification: taped magazines in jungle configurations, camouflage paint, improvised grips, swapped stocks, modified sights. The irony of the modification culture was that it proved American soldiers were capable of the same adaptive, innovative thinking that characterized the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. The enemy had been improvising weapons and tactics from the beginning, adapting captured French weapons, creating improvised explosive devices from unexploded American ordnance, modifying whatever they could scavenge into effective weapons. American forces, products of a military culture that emphasized standardization and by-the-book procedures, were forced by necessity to adopt similar improvisation. Staff Sergeant Michael Thornton survived his tour in Vietnam. He returned to the United States in early 1968. His duffel bag, containing not official military equipment, but the tools and knowledge to modify weapons that didn't work into weapons that did. The modified AK magazine he'd worked on that rainy evening at Firebase Delta came home with him, a souvenir of improvisation and survival. Years later, in interviews with military historians, Thornton would reflect on the modification culture. We trusted each other more than we trusted the system. The system gave us rifles that jammed. We gave ourselves rifles that worked. That's not how it's supposed to be, but that's how it was. Every guy in my squad could field strip an M16 blindfolded, could clear a malfunction in under 5 seconds, could modify a magazine to hold more rounds. We became experts because we had to, because the alternative was dying with a jammed rifle in our hands. The legacy of Vietnam's modification culture influenced American weapons development for decades. The M4 carbine, adopted in the 1990s, was a direct descendant of the XM177 that SOG had loved. The forward vertical grip, improvised in Vietnamese armory tents, became standard issue. The 30-round magazine that soldiers had demanded became universal. Even the chrome-plated chambers and barrels that had been omitted from early M16s to save money became standard features. Perhaps more significantly, the military learned that soldiers in combat zones needed the authority and resources to adapt their weapons to their environment. Modern military units deploy with organic armorer capabilities that far exceed what was available in Vietnam. Special operations units have even greater freedom to modify and customize their weapons, a direct legacy of MHVSOG's innovations. But the deeper lesson, the one that echoes through the stories of men like Staff Sergeant Thornton and Private Martinez, is about trust and betrayal. When you issue a soldier a weapon and tell him it will keep him alive, you have made a promise. When that weapon fails, you have broken that promise. When soldiers have to fix those failures themselves with file and imagination and desperate innovation, you have betrayed them in the most fundamental way possible. The story of improvised weapon modifications in Vietnam is ultimately a story about the gap between promise and reality, between what institutions say and what they deliver, between the comfortable certainty of stateside procurement offices and the brutal immediacy of jungle combat. It is the story of soldiers who laughed bitterly at the official assurances, who stopped trusting official channels, who learned that survival meant taking matters into their own hands. In armory tents and firebase bunkers across Vietnam, from 1966 through the end of American ground combat operations in 1973, soldiers filed and ground and modified and adapted. They turned 20-round magazines into 30-round magazines. They converted captured enemy equipment into American weapons. They cut down barrels, added grips, swapped stocks, painted weapons, and did whatever it took to transform what they were given into what they needed. They laughed at the improvised rifles initially, the ones with AK magazines filed to fit M16 magazine wells, the ones with forward grips made from spare pistol grips, the ones with barrels cut down and stocks swapped. They laughed until they realized these improvised solutions were more reliable than the official equipment. They laughed until the improvised weapons kept them alive through firefights where the official equipment would have failed. The laughter stopped. The modifications continued. And in the end, the soldiers who improvised, who adapted, who refused to trust a system that had betrayed them, were the ones who came home. The modified weapons came home too, many of them tucked into duffel bags and sea bags, souvenirs of a war where survival meant innovation. They rest now in attics and basements, in veteran museums and private collections, physical evidence of soldiers who wouldn't accept death from a jammed rifle, who took matters into their own hands, who proved that sometimes the best military equipment isn't what comes from the factory, but what comes from necessity, ingenuity, and the desperate determination to survive. In the end, the story of improvised weapon modifications in Vietnam is not about rifles and magazines and metal and wood. It is about trust broken and self-reliance forged. It is about soldiers betrayed by their institution who saved themselves and each other. It is about the sound of a file rasping on steel in a monsoon rain, about hands blackened with gun oil making the modifications that official channels would not, about men who refused to die because their weapons failed them. They laughed at the improvised rifles, until those improvised rifles brought them home alive